Well, hello dragons, and welcome to this instructional video for Lesson 9, Part 5, Fiscal Policy Strategies. The main idea behind this economics lesson is fiscal policy is influenced by the schools of supply-side economics and demand-side economics, both of which pursue the goal of economic growth. With that in mind, by the end of watching this video, you'll be able to explain how supply-side and demand-side theories differ, identify the chief tools of fiscal policy, and describe the factors that limit the success of fiscal policy. Now that the outcomes for this lesson have been shared with you, let's get started. You know that taxes are an important part of fiscal policy, but how does the government determine that policy? The answer can be found in two schools of economic thought: supply-side economics and demand-side economics. What is supply-side economics? Supply-side economics focuses on achieving economic stability and growth by increasing the supply of goods and services throughout the economy. Under supply-side economics, the government's role in the economy is limited to providing firms with incentives to increase production. As the supply of goods and services increases, their prices drop. Increased production also requires businesses to hire additional workers, leading to a lower unemployment rate. These workers then spend more money, increasing demand. The leading supporter of supply-side thought during its early years was French economist Jean-Baptiste Say. Say is best known for his statement that supply creates its own demand. According to this theory, producers provide enough goods and services to meet their own needs and produce additional goods and services to exchange for items that meet their wants. Suppose that Carl has a computer and a desktop publishing program. He creates flyers to let people know that he is beginning a desktop publishing business. In other words, he is advertising the supply of his services. Carl is able to do this because he already has met his own publishing needs. Melissa sees one of Carl's flyers and decides that she would like him to produce stationery printed with her name and address. Carl's supply, therefore, has created demand for his product. During the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan used many of the ideas of the supply-side economists when formulating his economic policies. Political party conflicts prevented Reagan's supply-side plans from being fully implemented. Instead, tax cuts were accompanied by spending increases. What, according to supply-side economists, is the government's role in the economy? Generally, they believe that the government should adopt a laissez-faire approach. In particular, the government should reduce taxes. Supply-side economists favor tax cuts to encourage individuals and firms to invest in new businesses and products. They argue that tax cuts increase individuals' disposable incomes and corporations' profits, and that some of this extra money will be invested. The increased tax revenue from businesses either begun or expanded with the new investment, along with reduced government spending, will offset the loss in revenue from the tax cuts. Supply-side economists also view many types of government regulation as obstacles to economic growth. They argue that excessive regulations can increase production costs, delay construction on public and private projects, and reduce incentives for businesses to develop new products. Why do some people disagree with the idea of the supply-side economists? Critics of the supply-side model question two major assumptions of supply-side theory. One assumption of all economic philosophies is that economists can predict the economic behaviors of people. Critics point out the limitations of this assumption. For example, in the 1980s, supply-side economists assumed that, for the most part, individuals and firms would invest the money they gained through tax cuts. Instead, many people chose to spend this money, increasing aggregate demand and inflation. Second, Critics of supply-side economics argue that many of the tax cuts are unfair. During the 1980s, for example, the wealthy benefited more from this tax cut legislation than did the poor. These critics also point out that spending cuts made along with the tax cuts fell most heavily on social programs for the poor, the unemployed, and other traditionally disadvantaged groups. Instead of concentrating on the importance of supply, demand-side economists emphasize the role of demand. Demand-side economics focuses on achieving economic growth through the government's influence on aggregate demand. The father of demand-side economics was British economist John Maynard Keynes. In 1936, Keynes published The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. With this book, he presented a theory that revolutionized economic thinking. Economists knew that changes in aggregate demand cause fluctuations in the business cycle. They recognized that when aggregate demand decreases, businesses produce fewer goods and lay off workers, causing a slowdown in economic growth. Based on his observations of economic activity during the Great Depression, Keynes reasoned that marketplace forces alone were not enough to increase aggregate demand during economic downturns. Instead, he argued that active government involvement was necessary to achieve full employment and improve sluggish business activity. Demand-side economics received a boost in the United States when Congress passed the Employment Act of 1946. This act pledged to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power in the U.S. economy. In effect, the act defined economic growth and stability as goals of the federal government. To meet these goals, the government began to use fiscal policy to fight economic downturns, unemployment, and rising prices. Although economists may disagree about the relative importance of supply-side or demand-side theories, they rely on the same methods of enacting fiscal policy. The 5 chief tools of fiscal policy are marginal tax rates, tax incentives, government spending, public transfer payments, and progressive income taxes. Congress often uses taxation to regulate aggregate demand in privately owned businesses. Suppose that businesses in many areas of the country begin to lay off workers. For example, if Lena loses her job with an advertising agency, she probably will reduce her expenses. As other people make similar choices, either because they have been laid off or because they anticipate losing their jobs, aggregate demand declines and the economy moves toward recession. How might Congress respond to this dilemma? To help reduce unemployment, Congress decreases taxes. This increases people's disposable incomes and allows firms to retain more of their profits. Additional money encourages more total spending or higher aggregate demand. To help limit inflation, Congress raises taxes. Higher taxes decrease an individual's disposable income and a corporation's profits. Higher taxes also slow business activity and reduce the chances of too much money chasing too few goods. The second tool of fiscal policy is tax incentives. A tax incentive is a special tax break that government extends to businesses to encourage investment in new capital. One major tax incentive is the investment tax credit, which permits firms to deduct from their corporate income taxes a percentage of the money they spend on new capital. To help reduce unemployment, Congress raises the investment tax credit, encouraging businesses to spend more money on expansion and thereby increasing aggregate demand. To help reduce inflation, Congress decreases the investment tax credit, which restricts business activity and thus lowers aggregate demand. How do tax incentives work? Suppose that Congress sets the investment tax credit at 40% in a given year, and that Computer Village, an internet service provider or ISP, invests $1 million in new capital. Under these conditions, Computer Village is able to deduct $400,000 from its income taxes. Thus, the real cost of the new capital is only $600,000 because of the $400,000 in tax savings. On the other hand, if the investment tax credit is 10%, an investment of $1 million in new capital results in a tax credit of just $100,000. As you can see, a lower investment tax credit discourages business investment. The third tool of fiscal policy is government spending. To help reduce inflation, Congress decreases government spending, resulting in lower aggregate demand and slower business activity. To help reduce unemployment, on the other hand, Congress increases government spending for goods and services. Higher spending on the nation's infrastructure increases aggregate demand and employment opportunities. Some tax dollars are redistributed to non-productive actors in the economy through public transfer payments. The term non-productive in this context means that no goods or services are created in exchange for these government payments. Today, these payments form a safety net of social programs for the people of the United States. One important type of public transfer payment is unemployment compensation. Consider again the case of Lena. When she loses her job, she becomes eligible for unemployment compensation. As unemployment rises, more people are eligible for this transfer payment, and the government automatically provides these funds to a larger percentage of the population. As the unemployment rate drops, on the other hand, state governments are able to reduce the amount of money they pump into the economy through this transfer payment. Many federal public transfer payments also tend to keep aggregate demand steady or rising. Social Security payments and veterans benefits, for example, provide income to elderly and disabled citizens. Likewise, health insurance through Medicare and Medicaid injects billions of dollars into the economy each year. As you know, the personal income tax and corporate income tax both are progressive taxes because higher incomes are taxed at higher rates. During periods of prosperity, the higher incomes of individuals and firms place them in higher tax brackets. When placed in a higher tax bracket, individuals pay a greater percentage of their incomes in taxes. Suppose that Jenna receives a pay raise and is thus in a higher tax bracket. How do higher taxes affect her wallet? Jenna's disposable income, or her income after taxes, does not increase by the same percentage as her total income. By lessening such increases in disposable incomes, higher tax rates lessen the increase in aggregate demand that might be caused by rapidly rising incomes. During recessions, on the other hand, incomes tend to fall. Many individuals and firms are taxed at lower rates because they earn less and therefore are in lower tax brackets. The lower tax rates lessen the possibility of a disastrous drop in aggregate demand. Although fiscal policy is designed to regulate aggregate demand in the economy, putting policies to work is not always a smooth process. The four most important limitations are timing problems, political pressures, unpredictable economic behaviors, and lack of coordination among government policies. For fiscal policy to be effective, it must be used, much like a medicine, in proper doses and at the proper time. Timing problems revolve around the challenges of economic forecasting, as well as a number of possible delays. Economic forecasting is an inexact science. Economists rely on a variety of sources to predict future levels of business activity, but interpretations of this data often vary. The uncertainties about future economic problems often lead to policymakers to take a wait-and-see position. Significant delays may occur between the time that the government identifies an economic problem and the time that stabilization policies have an impact on the economy. For example, the current process for developing the U.S. budget, which outlines specific taxation and spending policies, takes more than a year to formulate and approve. Other important delays involve the amount of time that tax or spending policies have to ripple through the economy once they are approved. For example, suppose the government injects $50 billion into the economy by reducing taxes and increasing government expenditures. The full effects of this policy will not be felt for several months or even years because it takes time for this money to be spent and respent in the economy. Because fiscal policy is established by Congress and the President, the elected representatives of the people, it is more affected by political pressures than is monetary policy. These elected officials, unlike the Fed's Board of Governors, can be voted out of office if they make unpopular taxation and spending decisions. Thus, both political and economic concerns can influence the formulation of fiscal policy in a free enterprise economy. Restrictive fiscal policy increases taxes and reduces government spending. As a result, restrictive fiscal policy tends to limit price increases by reducing aggregate demand. How do people react to restrictive fiscal policy? Consider again the case of Jenna. Because she pays higher taxes, her disposable income is reduced. Her expenses do not decrease, however, which makes her less likely to save, invest, or increase the consumption of goods or services. Economists refer to the negative side effects of restrictive fiscal policy as a fiscal drag on the economy. In addition, lower government spending often means cutting specific programs. Citizens who benefit from a government program that loses funding and is reduced or even eliminated may decide to vote against the politicians who voted to decrease their benefits. Expansionary fiscal policy, on the other hand, decreases taxes and increases government spending to stimulate business activity in the economy, thus increasing aggregate demand. Expansionary fiscal policy often is popular because people's disposable incomes rise as their taxes decrease. Still, political pressures on expansionary fiscal policy do exist. First, some people oppose a larger government role in the economy. Believing that the market, not the government, should ensure long-term growth and stability, these people oppose new government spending. Second, many people have become concerned about the combined effects of lower taxes and higher government expenditures. A third challenge to fiscal policy is the difficulty of predicting how people will respond to the government's economic actions. When developing fiscal policy, government officials rely on models that are based on economic principles and past economic behaviors. Policymakers have no guarantees, however, that people will react to fiscal policies in exactly the same manner as they have in the past. A fourth limitation on fiscal policy is the difficulty of coordinating the efforts of government agencies. At the national level, fiscal policy needs to be coordinated with monetary policy to achieve common goals. For example, if inflation is seen as the most pressing problem, monetary and fiscal policies should work to reduce aggregate demand. The Federal Reserve needs to institute a tight money policy, reducing the money supply and the availability of credit, while Congress and the President need to agree on a restrictive fiscal policy. If recession and unemployment are the primary concerns, an easy money policy, increasing the money supply and the availability of credit, and an expansionary fiscal policy are needed. Without this coordination, fiscal policy will be less effective. In addition, taxation and spending policies on local and state levels must be coordinated with federal stabilization efforts. In many cases, such coordination is not present. For example, local and state governments tend to increase their expenditures for education and other services during periods of prosperity because tax revenues are high and credit is usually easy to obtain. Increased spending by local and state governments during these periods tend to increase aggregate demand and to fuel price increases. At the same time, however, the federal government may be following a restrictive fiscal policy to reduce inflation. So that's the way it is with Lesson 9, Part 5, Fiscal Policy Strategies. At this point, you should know that supply-side economic policies influenced public economic policy in the United States during the 1980s, while demand-side policies were utilized in the 1930s. The chief tools of fiscal policy are marginal tax rates and tax incentives, government spending, public transfer payments, and the progressive income tax. And fiscal policy has several limitations. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to have the entire catalog of economics videos available at your fingertips. Click the subscribe button and then click the follow bell to receive notifications as to when the channel is updated. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in class, Dragons!